Hey everybody, Chris here from It's Me Made, and in this video we are going to be kicking off our Cura support series. And we're going to go back to basics, talking about all of the things that you really need to know when it comes to supports when getting started. So let's not waste any more time and get into this video. So this video is actually all user driven because I actually sent out a survey in my community tab and throughout my other communities to ask what kind of problems are you facing when it comes to supports. And you guys were, it was amazing. I was overwhelmed with the amount of responses, but there were definite themes in everybody's issues. And that is what this entire series is going to be built on, answering all of your questions. Now this video is all about the basics because I had a ton of questions about the basics, about when do I need to add supports? What are supports? Which supports should I be using? I mean, there's a lot of different things. So we're going to take all of this one step at a time. So to answer the most basic of basic questions, and that is, what are supports? So supports are basically other structures that are being built on your build plate at the same time as your model. And what these structures are actually doing is going up underneath the model and supporting an overhang. And that overhang is actually being printed on top of that support. And this allows your 3D print not to collapse on itself or honestly just give you a complete failed print. Now, most of the time, the support structure is actually being printed in the same material. So if you have a 3D printer that just has one spool of filament and it's feeding right into your drive, well, that's exactly what you're going to be getting. It's going to be printing in the same filament. But there are those printers out there that actually print in multicolor. And for those, you can actually print in different types of filament. There's actually a support filament out there that you can actually print that as your supports only, and they break off a lot easier. Now, one of the big things to actually think about is more supports mean more waste because we don't use these supports once the 3D print is done. When it's all done, we're just breaking them off and then throwing away those supports. So just keep that in mind. Now, when it comes to the different types of supports, there's two main kinds. The first one is usually on most of the slicers called normal supports. The second one is called tree supports, or sometimes they're called organic supports. And these are the two main kinds. Normal supports is more of a lattice and more of towers that come straight up. But an organic support or tree supports look more like trees. It has a very large trunk, and then once it gets closer to the 3D print itself, they start breaking off into branches. Now, when it came to me asking you guys what your biggest issues are, the first and foremost biggest issue that I heard about was, how do I know when I need supports? And I know for some of us that might be 3D printing for quite some time now, that just might make sense. But honestly, when I was first starting out, I had no idea. It just took me a ton of failures to understand that. But that was also over a decade ago. So things have changed since then. So let's just take a minute and go over all of the different circumstances of why you would actually need supports on your 3D print. So let's go over some of the most basic ones and the easiest to actually find on your 3D models. And that is bridges and overhangs. Now, bridges are those things that where the filament is actually going from one piece of the model to another piece. So like the hot end is going back and forth. And that is actually called a bridge, what's going between two things. Now, a bridge isn't always an exact bridge across, but let's think about it in another way. Let's say I have a model and it's holding a staff and his arm is like this and his torso is right here. Now, it's printing this staff all the way up and all of the way up the torso, but when it gets to the arm, it's actually going across and there's nothing underneath here. And that is actually considered a bridge. So those are the kind of things that you really want to be looking for when there's like long gaps between two pieces of a model. And that starting point can actually be a good point where it will give you a fail. So those points between the staff and the body, this point right here, that's actually a critical point that you're going to need supports, because if you don't, it's just going to like droop down and you're not going to get the print you're looking for, trust me. Now the other one is an overhang, and I actually have this 3D model that I made in Tinkercad to kind of show us all of the different things. Now this right here is an overhang, where it keeps coming over at an angle, and I've got one right here on this side. This goes at a 45-degree angle, a 50, 60, 70, and then right here at the end is the 70-degree angle. So this is a good idea to see really what this is. And the corner right here, this is a straight overhang. So you can see that there is nothing underneath here, and it's just straight up printing this. And that is probably one of the worst overhangs you can have. So you might be wondering, well, what happens when you just print it without supports? And this is what happens. So I 3D printed this without any supports, and you can see it's kind of a mess. You can see all of the filament strands of where the hot end went back and forth, back and forth. And the cool thing about 3D prints, even when you get some fails, sometimes it actually corrects itself. Because of when the filament is coming down, the fan is actually cooling that filament, and it's only drooping down so far. And then when you get more and more layers built up on top of it, it will actually start to save itself. Now, this isn't always the case, but in this case, it actually did. But the top still is looking pretty bad. Now, another thing to look for, when you have a 3D model that has a lot of intricate geometry, and maybe they're not a lot of overhangs, but maybe it just needs a little bit more support to ensure that that print is going to print beautifully. Because when there's a lot of detail, and there's a lot of intricate detail, let's say a sword and things like that, sometimes you just want it to have that little bit of extra support. Because maybe that sword is at a 45-degree angle, and you're thinking, oh yeah, that'll print, but it might mess up. So if I add a support, it's actually going to give a little bit of a redundancy. And that is something that you also want to think about when you're 3D printing. Because if you think that, I might be able to get away with it, then you might honestly just want to add some supports to be safe. Now, the longer you 3D print, the more experience you're going to get at this, and you're going to realize that you're like, no, this one's a lot like that last one, and I didn't have supports on it, and it worked out just fine. Or this one was like that one that failed, and I didn't add supports, and I should have. It just takes time to actually learn your models and what you're specifically printing and when to add supports when it comes to that complex geometry. Now, the last one is one of those things that probably people miss the most, and it's what gets you almost every single time. And that is islands. Because when you slice your software, you're not properly checking to see if there are any islands. Because you might have a 3D print that looks like, oh yeah, it might say it's support free, but is it? Nope, it's not. Because not every model is support free, even though it says it might be support free. So you always want to double check your slicing settings and just drag that through and look for any islands. So let's jump over to Cura so I can show you the easiest way to spot islands to know if you need supports on your 3D print. Alright, so we're in Cura, and I went ahead and threw this model in. It's of Colossus throwing Wolverine. It's a cool little chibi. And this is a really nice model for examples of islands, because there are little tiny islands and giant islands when it comes to this 3D print. So, by itself right now, there is no way I could ever 3D print this in FDM without supports. So, let's go ahead and go over to the preview, and I'm going to show you where these islands actually are. So, I've got it sliced, and I'm going to come over here to the right side to my little bar right here, and click the dot and drag it all the way down. So now I am going to just bring this all the way up really slowly and start to show you when we see our first big island, and right there. So, we can see that the torso, everything from right this point on, was going to print really nicely. But if we come over here and I click on this dot and I just hit my up arrow and go layer by layer, we're going to start to see right here. So if we zoom in right at the hand and I go up right here, it's going to put a little bit just in midair, and then it's going to keep going and keep adding these layers. And this right here is not attached to anything.
and it's supposed to just print, you know, in midair, even though it has nothing to print onto like a support. So this is actually called an island. This is what an island is, when it's printing and not connected to anything and just printing in midair. So if I keep going up here, we can see that there are quite a few little islands just on this arm alone. So there's the fingers, there's the palm right here, here's some of the wrist, here's some of the forearm, and eventually they all start to connect, as you see. But even then, before it fully connects, it is creating a big island right here of the hand and then the forearm. And you keep going up and it prints all of it together, and then it's all one piece. Now, those are an example of very small islands, and sometimes those can be really hard to miss, like if it's something just this small. But realizing that we knew that this arm wasn't going to print out all on its own out here. Now, if we keep going up, we can see a bunch of other islands being formed, like let's say the chin right here. This is an island that is being formed. Then if we keep going up, we're going to see Wolverine's claws, and this is the biggest one right here. So we have 3 islands right there, one for each claw. Then it starts to connect to the hand, and it keeps going up and keeps going up and keeps going up. But if you notice, we have the whole arm completely printed, and it's not connected to anything. So you can see right here that these are 2 giant islands, because these are supposed to just print in midair and everything be just fine. But unfortunately, that is not how it works, and there is no way we can actually print this without supports. So we would actually have to enable supports and then slice this so it actually has something to print onto. And then if we see right here the chin, right there on the chin is the very last island, and it keeps printing. Oh, nope, right there the nose has an island as well. So there are a lot of islands on this model, and those are the things that you need to look for. So it is always super helpful to just come over here and click on this bar on the right hand side and just go up and down real quick to see, okay, do I see anything just appearing randomly like this hand and this thumb right here? And if you see any of that, you know you are absolutely going to need supports.
Alright, real quick, I just have to say thank you. Thank you to all of these amazing people for supporting me on Patreon this month. If you want to be like these awesome people, you will get exclusive access to my private Discord channels where we talk about printing, painting, softwares, and everything else in between. And you'll also be able to see all of my behind-the-scenes content of what I'm working on and what's going on in the workshop. But I just wanted to say thank you guys. Other than that, let's get back to the video. Alright, so now we're going to talk about our support overhang angle. And if you don't know what that is, I'm going to explain it to you with 2x4s. Because I figured this is going to be the best way to understand really what it is and at the core of it. So imagine each 2x4 is a layer line, okay? So this would be printing with a really big nozzle. But the big thing is imagine that I'm 3D printing something, and this is just a straight wall, and it's just stacking it just like that. Now, imagine if I have an overhang. So when I'm 3D printing, it's actually just coming a little bit over and a little bit over every single time I 3D print. So you can see that if it's connected to the infill, it's going to keep holding it there. And then it'll just keep going over and keep going over. And you can see eventually it's going to really want to fight and just start to fall over. But there are certain angles that we could be printing at, like a less of a steep angle, and it will want to just stay by itself like this. So if I'm printing like this and it's just slowly coming out like this, I have a very shallow overhang angle, and it is going to stay perfect. And it's going to print a really nice wall. So that's the big thing. So basically, you're wanting to find what angle you can 3D print at before your 3D printer is going to start failing on some of those layers. Now, obviously, when it comes to 2x4s, you're like, oh yeah, but I just thought that this would really help you understand of that weight. And the other thing to think about is, think about if this is a very thin line. And think about if my overhang angle is a very large area and it's barely on there, think about how that's going to start drooping. And then think about when I add to the next one, it's going to start drooping even more. And that is really where we're going to get that filament droopage, because there's nothing to actually for it to bond to. But when they are actually stacking on top and overlapping just a little bit like this, it actually has something to bond to. And that's the important thing to understand. And plus, I just wanted to use some 2x4s in a 3D printing tutorial. I thought that'd be kind of fun. Alright, so 2x4s aside, there is a file on Thingiverse that will help us find our support overhang angle. And I will go ahead and put a link to that below. And now, let's go ahead, jump over to Cura, and I'm going to show you how we can set this file up, print it out, and then we can inspect it.
So once we get the file from Thingiverse, we can just throw it right on our print bed in Cura. And there's a couple things we want to make sure. First, we want to come over here to supports and make sure that supports are turned off, because we want this actually to fail at a certain point. We do not want supports to kind of, make it a nice print. Now, the next thing is really dependent on you and your comfort level. If you think that this will print no problem on your printer, then let's just slice it and hit print. But if not, what we want to do is go to Build Plate Adhesion, go to the drop down, and where it says None, we want to put a brim on. And typically, I like to do a brim count of 20, and that way it will actually widen our base and we can have a better adhesion for our very first layer. That way, it'll stay there and not break off during the print. Now, the other thing that I want to mention, when you're printing this, you definitely want to have this at the layer height of your 3D prints that you're going to be using your supports. So at a 0.12 is what I am going to be printing everything that I'm using supports for. But if I was also going to be using a 0.2 millimeter layer height, I would have to print out another one. So the big thing I just want to get across here is if you have multiple layer heights that you're using, you should be printing out one of these for every single layer height that you use, because your layer height can actually affect your support overhang angle. Because at the end of the day, we want to see at what point these are going to start failing so we know what angle is going to work best for us. Alright, so once I got it sliced, I just double checked to see that my brim is there to help with my adhesion, and I also like to just kind of slide down real quick to make sure that everything is looking good. And this is looking perfect. So now I'm actually going to save this out for all of my different printers that I'm going to be printing this on, and in the different layer heights if you're actually doing it with different layer heights as well. So I'm going to save these out and get the printers printing.
Alright, so I have printed these support overhang tests on 3 different machines. So right here we have the Ender 3 V3KE, such a long name, and this is printed on the Ankermake M5c, and this one is printed on a Delta printer, which is the FLSun V400. So let's go ahead and look at these one at a time. Alright, so let's look at the Ender 3 KE first. And this is the thing. When we're actually looking at these and trying to find our overhang angle, we're not actually going to look at the front side. The whole purpose of this is actually seeing the underside of our actual model. So if we look, we can see that the overhang where the actual filament starts to just kind of overhang and droop. And that's what we're really looking for. So let's zoom in here. So we can see right here that everything is looking really nice. So all we got to do is actually first see what this angle is right here, because this is where it actually looks perfect. So I'm just going to put this around, and we're going to see that that is printed at a 50-degree angle. So a 50-degree angle prints beautifully on the Ender 3. Now, if I flip this over, and then we're going to keep looking, and we look to the next level, and I'm like, okay, honestly, the 60 degrees doesn't look too bad. So I could actually follow this around and see that the 60 degrees looks really nice. And then if we keep looking, we can see that the 70 degrees is, it's not really terrible, but it's not super great. So I like to be a little conservative, so I am going to say that the 60 degrees is my support overhang angle for my Ender 3. So 60 degrees is the angle that I need to go with. So now let's look at the Ankermake M5c and how well it did. So if I switch this over and then we actually start to really look on the underside here, we can see that it's a pretty clear thing that right here, whatever this is actually looking its nicest. So if I just follow this all the way around, I can see 60 degrees is also the best angle for my Ankermake 3D printer. And that's all we've got to do, is we just got to keep finding what looks good. And honestly, if you're happy with this, you can absolutely make 70 degrees your support overhang angle. There's nothing wrong with that. It's just not as clean as I would like, so I am going to kind of stay away from that. I want to have it as clean as possible. And honestly, 50 is the most safe, but 60, I don't know. It looks pretty good. There's a little bit of flaws, but I'm not too worried about that. It's worth testing. Now if we actually jump over to our Delta 3D printer, this one doesn't handle the overhangs that well, honestly. So when it comes to this angle, it just did terrible. But this one right here, it's looking really good. And that is a 50 degrees. So 50 degrees is my support overhang for my V400. But I just wanted to show you the differences. So this right here is 80 degrees and 70 degrees. And look at that. Now, if we compare it to the Ender 3, look at the difference of that. Now, you might be looking at that and be like, oh, wow, so the Ender 3 is just a better printer than the V400. And that honestly isn't always the case. With this 3D print, it just didn't handle it very well. I probably could adjust my speeds on this and be able to get the same type of 3D print. But the thing is I'm using my default settings. I'm not doing any adjustments to be able to slow down, to be able to get a better overhang. So if I wanted to, I guarantee I could probably get this printer looking just like the Ender 3 or even the Ankermake, because these were going a little bit slower than this one, because this one was actually printing at 400 millimeters a second and it sped through it. And this was about 275, I do believe. It wasn't printing at the full 300. And that honestly makes a big difference. So I just want you to kind of consider that. If you really want to get a better overhang, you need to slow down your 3D prints. But I wanted to print these at my default, like I said. So now that we know our support overhang angles, let's go ahead into Cura, and I'm going to show you where we can change this setting to match what our new angles are.
We can go ahead and add it into our settings. So the first thing we need to do is come over here to our support settings. And the big thing is if you do not see all of the settings that I see, all you're going to have to do is come over here to this little hamburger icon, and then it'll give you a drop down, and you want to click on the all. And then it will show you all of the settings, not just some of the settings. So let's come over here to support, click on the triangle, and let that drop down. Then we're going to see generate support. We need to check this to be able to access all of our settings. So if this is already checked, you're going to be able to see everything already. Now the one thing that we need to look at is, are we using a tree support or normal? So if we go over here and we click on normal, we can see just a couple down, we're going to see what our support overhang angle is. So it's right here, support overhang angle, and right now we are at 45 degrees. But we determined that for the Ankermake, 60 degrees is going to be just fine for us to start our testing. So I'm going to just type in 60 and hit enter, and there we go. Now remember, our support overhang angle is what determines whether we need supports or not. So if it's above that angle that we just set, it's going to add supports. If it's below that, it's not going to add supports. And the best way that we can actually see this is if we rotate and go underneath our model, and we can see that all of this red right here. This red means we need supports. So if you are looking at your model and you see red on the model, that means that it is needing supports because it is going past your support overhang angle. And if we rotate around here, we can see that it's the 80 and 70. So we're rotating around and see the 70 and 80. But the 60 is not going to give us any supports. So that is probably the most important thing to understand, is when we put in our correct angle, it is only going to alert us to put supports when we're past that angle that our 3D printer will not print at. Now, the last thing, let me show you where you change it if you're on tree supports. So if we're on tree, we can see right here that it has changed all of our settings. And if we come all the way down here, we can see our support overhang angle has actually moved way down here. And this is the number that we want to put in. And it's still set at 60. So even if I switch between tree or normal, we're still going to have the same setting. And if you're having troubles finding this actual setting, all you have to do is come up to the search bar and just start typing support overhang settings. And right here you can see support over, and it automatically is at the top. So just in case you're ever having issues, the search bar is very useful, especially when there's so many different settings being shown all at once. So now that we know our support overhang angle, let's jump to the next topic.
Now, if you're new to 3D printing, and I mean new to 3D printing, sometimes you might be bringing in a 3D model and it will come in a weird way. And I mean like a weird way on your 3D print bed. And you're like, oh, that's kind of weird. And if you don't know, you can actually rotate this to be able to fit on your build plate in a certain way. And that is one of the biggest things that I think a lot of beginners have problems with. Being able to understand when they need to orient their models in a different way. And you might not be able to get rid of supports completely, but you might be able to minimize your supports if you turn your model the right way. So, for instance, this model right here, I actually made this as a support test. And it's got all of these overhangs and things like that. But I could actually print this perfectly just by doing this. And that's exactly what I did. There are no overhangs on this model in any way if I turn it upside down. And that's the big thing I want you to understand. When you're dealing with your models, sometimes you can actually turn your models in a certain way to be able to get even less supports than you originally would have to have when you bring your model in. So knowing that this is going to have so many supports in all of these different areas, and I'm like, how could I actually 3D print this to have less supports? Maybe if I rotate it. So if I turn this on its side like this, yeah, that is going to be a lot less supports, but it's still going to give me some supports right here. But if I flip it over, then there we go. There's no supports. So it might take some trial and error if you're a beginner at 3D printing. And that's okay. But for some of us, we can just look at it and be like, oh yeah, I definitely need to print this like that. But if I have to, I could probably print it like this. That way I only have to support this spot right here. Because this circle will print without a support because of my overhang angle. Now I realize that this is a very visual way for you to see of like how I can rotate my model. But let's go into Cura and I'm going to show you this exact model and how we can identify when we don't have any supports at all and when we actually need to have supports.
So I have this awesome bust of Darth Vader, and this is one of the techniques that a lot of modelers do to where that's actually going to be printing at an angle to remove any need for supports. Now, the modeler says that this is completely support free. And if we remember, using our support overhang angle at 60 degrees, if we look underneath the model, we're going to see red spots to where this is where we're going to actually need supports. Now, this is the one thing that I want you to understand. Now, when you see this, there are a few things that we can do. You can either A, add supports, or B, kind of see if you don't need supports. Now, this is the way that I like to test it. So, I see that there is just a few little areas that says like, oh yeah, you need supports in these areas because it might not print it well. So what I'm going to do is I am actually going to go to my support overhang angle, and we said for my Ankermake M5c, it is going to need a 60 degree overhang angle. So we know that 70 was just a little too much. 60 was pretty good. Now, let's change our support overhang angle to 65 to see how much goes away and how much of it is just a little bit over 60 degrees. So now that I changed that to 65 degrees, you can see that all of this is almost gone. A lot of the other areas have gotten a lot smaller. And if we look underneath here, some of that has been removed too. So it honestly looks like a lot of this could probably be printed just fine. And if we remember that 70 degrees was printing, it just didn't look that great, we can type in 70 and see if all of our stuff has gone away. And honestly, almost everything has gone away except for just this little ridge right here. And I think the big thing is to understand is look at where these little overhangs are happening. Because right here, that's actually underneath the chin, and you're not going to be seeing it that much. And you can also just touch it up with a little bit of sandpaper. So is it worth having supports on your model and wasting all of that filament to have supports? Versus what if one or two little areas just don't look the greatest and I'm just going to have to clean them up a little bit? And that's kind of the thing that you really want to look at. Like, do I really need to have supports in these areas? Just because there's those red dots doesn't always mean that you need supports. This is where you want to start to use your best judgment and playing with your support overhang angle to understand how much of that is actually areas that's going to be needing supported versus it's just a little bit above what the angle is supposed to be. Now to show you on the opposite spectrum, I have this bust of Golem from Lord of the Rings. And you can see automatically we have a very large overhang right here, the chin. And it is all red, and you can see it all red. And this is one of those areas that you're not going to be able to get away with that. So even if we change this to say 70 degrees and I hit enter, you can see underneath here, it's still all red, and there is nothing we can do to change that fact. Because when we slice this, you can see as we go down, there is right here, it's actually printing an island, and then it's just a really big overhang. Like, look at that overhang. So this is one of those things that we absolutely are going to need supports because of all of this area. Like, this area cannot print by itself. So that is another area that you want to look at to where, okay, that is really big and there is an island. On the Darth Vader, there was no islands whatsoever. It was all connected. Now, could I possibly print this in another way for my orientation to remove a lot of that? 100%. But it might not sit in the perfect way for you. Because I could turn this and I could rotate it and I could come back a little bit. Then I can just bring it down past just like a lot of the other modelers do. And then I'm just going to have to figure out a way to mount this because the back will actually be at an angle. So if I slice this and then I bring it all the way down, we can see that now there isn't that big of an overhang angle. Like, it's actually just kind of coming out. Now, there still is some islands. And no matter what, we're going to need supports for this. But there are just different ways that you can do things with your models to remove the need for your supports.
So this was just the basics of supports and kind of giving you that solid foundation to get started, because in this series we are going to be diving deep into supports, and by the end of it, I promise you're going to understand supports and you're going to be able to have the most perfect supports for your 3D printer. And I think the big thing is, I just want to reiterate, not all 3D printers are the same. So just because I have certain settings that I'm using for one printer does not mean it's going to be perfect for all the printers. So if you look, my support overhangs are completely different when it comes to different 3D printers. With this Delta printer, I mean, it didn't handle the overhangs too well. But with my Ender 3, it actually handled them pretty well. So just keep that in mind, because if you see somebody's settings and they're not working for you, you got to remember, well, that setting works for their printer. So just keep that in the back of your head. And as always, it's a lot easier to find models that are support free. But it's not always viable. Like, sometimes you need to print something that's going to take supports. So it's really important to understand how you can orient them in the proper way, and if they actually need supports and the amount of supports you need to add. So I hope this has helped. If you have any other questions when it comes to the basics of supports, let me know. I really would like to know, and I will try to answer it in a future video for you. Other than that, I wish you a great day, and I will go ahead and see you over here in this next video.